The story we are about to tell you is about shells. Empty shells. At least, this is what it might seem like at first. Because as much as the shells look empty, they're never really empty. A new crew is already on board, and everyone is busy with their tasks. But in the human world, a few centimeters above the surface, a shell is about to have a totally different fate. The fate of a proud two-master vessel taking up the ocean by storm. The day settles. The most important thing to do before going on a great adventure is preparation. Her new owners take her out of the water for a few minor repairs. They make her look as good as new before going out on the open water. Because beneath their preparation lies what everyone ultimately wants: the opportunity to find a perfect shell. Like a hermit crab, the crew changes their shell to embark on the Kanaga. Their objective? To film shipwrecks lying below the surface in the Bermuda Triangle. The hull of the Kanaga now harbors 7 humans, a small sailor family, and 4 landlubbers fascinated by scuba diving. Stuck in their daily routine, the crew fast succumbs to the hermit crab syndrome, an obsession to find a new shell. So, here lies the crew, novice shipmates sailing off to meet species that, too, chose to go down unknown paths.
Attends, il y a un problème là.
A bit anxious, they take in their surroundings, and time seems to stretch. In this type of environment, the forces of the ocean take another dimension. The crew feels tiny and insignificant standing on their ship in the middle of this gigantic body of water. The crew gets a glimpse of the seabed through the archipelago crystal clear waters and begins to imagine their future dives. It's now time for the first stop on a deserted island. The Bermuda Triangle abounds with vessels below the surface. Lots of stories are based on these wrecks, which makes the crew curious about exploring these remnants of the past. The beach and its untouched sand reminds the crew of pirate stories. But to each his treasures, the crew is looking for a wreck stranded on the east end of the island. There is a difference between what is on their map and what is really there, however. It looks like the natural elements of the region got rid of just about everything on this wreck. Nothing worth taking, the flippers are out. The emptiness of the island gets to the crew much more than the rest does. There is absolutely no trace of human touch besides this piece of scrap metal and footprints. The island is surrounded by a reef, a complex organization that has been in place for millenniums. And even though there is no captain nor sailor, everyone plays a crucial role in the survival of the reef. The architect of these great structures is the coral. These organisms create a haven that protects them from the currents, offering food and shelter to a large variety of animals. Coral may look like a plant, but it's in fact an animal, or rather a colony of thousands of tiny organisms called polyps. A number of very different species live inside the reef, and, just like on the boat, each one has a specific role and territory. Here, however, anyone who tries to impinge on his neighbor is quickly told off. Prey and predators alike live side by side while still attempting to not get in each other's ways. The balance of life on the reef is put through very harsh elements, and should it break, lots of its inhabitants will disappear. The coral, destroyed by hurricanes, also constitutes a sort of blank page on which life will slowly regrow. Coral and larvae, mostly brought by the currents, will grow on their predecessor skeletons. In the middle of the vast ocean, these larvae are not very demanding, but some intruders turn out to be useful. When the conditions are right, this bare shell will quickly be colonized and become the basis for a new reef. The crew is now approaching their next stop, the wreck of the Bimini barge. Taken by a hurricane at the end of the 1980s, it lies at the boundary of the continental shelf, at the mercy of the Gulf Stream. The crew checks that their equipment is waterproof before putting it on. "30 meters is not that deep, but they won't have much time. As the surface moves away, the pressure increases on their wetsuits. The crew finally gets a glimpse of the barge, after having pictured it for so long in their minds. At the core of the wreck, they discover a true underwater city. It is a total frenzy on the deck, and an arrow crab looks like he is directing traffic among schools of different species. movement is restricted. Every square centimeter and every corner of the wreck is meticulously occupied. Currents go through walls covered in sea sponge and coral. This new reef now attracts hundreds of sedentary fish, but also a few curious creatures from outer sea. The crew are only temporary guests in this world, and the air in their bottles are starting to get low. They must return to the surface. The Bimini barge lets us get a glimpse of a particular piece of her history 40 years after her sinking. Nature seems to have taken hold of this foreign element. How can some mere sheets of metal shelter so much life? As soon as the crew surfaces, they go again. At least, that's what they would like. As for now, the wind has disappeared. Their sails are nothing more than gigantic sun umbrellas and seem to be mocking them. This reminds them they are at the mercy of natural forces that do not care about their needs. A little patience is sometimes all that's needed. The fate of every single being is closely related to its environment and other living creatures. Man always showed great ingenuity in limiting the impact of such external elements. Man tries to control everything, especially its peers and their territories. It is with this bizarre goal in mind that the construction of the SS Sapona started. Originally built for transporting troops, her belly ended up being a breeding ground for other stories. Contraband vessel and a floating casino, she ended up aground. Her martial origins eventually caught up with her, however, and she was eventually used as an aerial target during the Second World War. Its motivation sometimes being different, nature compares very well with man when it comes to expressing violence. It is a perpetual fight for survival that has been going on for millions of years and only has two possible outcomes: life or death. Following an arms race to keep one's spot in the kingdom of the living, camouflaging, deadly poisons, strong armors, and even strategic alliances, it is a no-holds-barred type of environment, a timeless struggle happening right in front of our eyes. This almost invisible fight started when the ship grounded. It is a war for the colonization for a few pieces of scrap metal. The main challengers in this territory-grabbing game are algae, sea sponge, and coral, who fight a merciless war to gain the best spot. Although they seem motionless and anchored, these animals put up a permanent fight to push back the front line. Excessive growth, toxic substances, and filament deployed to control their neighbors. Once these organisms are settled, new species will be attracted by this strange-looking reef. Other wars start for the most discreet or better protected hiding spot. This sergeant major patrols around its eggs, and all hope lies in these hundreds of small eyes. His very little strategic choice attracted attention. Its defense does not resist long before the gorals and the damselfish start feasting on its offspring. To ensure the well-being of the future generation, the Sergeant Major must choose quantity. Only a few of the many embryos will allow its DNA to survive. A few meters away, a hermit crab has found the perfect shell. Strong, but not too heavy to move around. The problem is guarding it when a bigger inhabitant finds it. A long siege starts and everyone stays put. Ending up naked or in a shell that is too big is unthinkable. For some, the night is a time to sleep, but for the crew, it's the opportunity to explore new horizons. Everything now seems silent. The reef frenzy has stopped, and the crew now stares at the immensity of the ocean. Their view stops where their ship lights end. They observe a brand new sample of life that looks nothing like they've come across so far. Slipper lobster hiding under rocks during the day just came out. They venture to dig the sand protected by their shell. Like the hermit crab looking for its dinner, the lobster tirelessly looks for worms, shellfish, and seashells that it will crush with its powerful jaws. The crew's lights are not very discreet in this almost total darkness, and they're suddenly attacked by thousands of tiny organisms. Shrimps, copepods, jellyfish, and all sorts of fish. A lot of them form the plankton, frail creatures carried around by the current and going up towards the surface at dusk. The lack of light might inconvenience some, but others manage to adapt and reap out some benefits from it. This lemon shark, observing the crew, uses electromagnetic fields to find its way and spot prey. Predators own the night, and the reef is a dangerous place to hang around at this time. But the red lionfish doesn't care. Its fins are covered with poisonous spikes protecting it from various enemies. It's looking for prey to bring to a corner of the reef before swallowing it up in one gulp. A parrotfish is too big of a victim, and it stays immobile for another reason. A Moray Eel is lurking. This skilled hunter has very bad eyesight and relies on its sense of smell, while its mucus-covered skin allows it to glide among the coral. The crew's lights don't only attract plankton, but also some very impressive creatures. A common stingray just reminded them that they're merely guests on its territory, and it's about time that they went home. This morning, something has changed. The sky has disappeared, the temperature is lowering rapidly, and the wind is turning. A tropical wave is right behind the crew, and they must not waste time. Under the hull, the marine creatures remain unconcerned by the meteorological problems unless the Kanaga decides to reach for the bottom. The storm front is finally behind them, and they take turns steering the ship to reach the next wreck. They sometimes see other ships and share paths for a short while. They let their imagination wander and invent lives they hardly see. The crew continues their route, each one of them cozy in their shell. They wonder what its limit really is. Even though the mind sometimes wanders, they must remain alert during night shifts. A pair watches the course and the sails, but most of all, protects the crew members' lives. The Kanaga logbook records the daily itinerary. Like a guideline of their trip, it gives the crew the opportunity to keep a proper idea of time. Although the shift pace is sometimes brutal, they get a chance to rediscover seemingly ordinary moments. They take the time to pause and observe their environment and see things differently. they see a reef shark and take the time to look at its shape, one can pinpoint the evolution. Sharks have been living across history in oceans for over 400 million years. The wreck of the Ray of Hope only spent 15 years below the surface. Nothing compared to the history of life. Our hero and this shark have entirely different lives that cross paths but rarely meet. Who would bet that these two species come from the same cells? And that over time, through interactions and chance, evolution gave one claws and the other fins. Evolution is a sort of DIY, where each generation receives the same organizational plan, but where all individuals are slightly different. This diversity is highly noticeable on the wrecks. This evolution sometimes reveals surprising solutions, and the path a species takes may be closely linked to another's. This is the case with the remora. Its fins progressively transform into suction cups, and it uses them to leach onto other animals. It gets transport and feeds on parasites and leftovers from host meals. The Caribbean sharks ruffle and get together right before the crew's eyes. A female is followed by two males who seem very interested. A ballet starts where the male tries to catch its partner's fins. The female's skin, being thicker, is better able to sustain this water courtship. The crew's minds and cameras fill with images, and they take a last look at the flippers. Between earth and sea, mangrove is the ideal growing ground. The shallow waters are rich in nutrients, and predators rarely venture there. Lots of the young are left to fend for themselves immediately after birth, like this young shark. Luckily, everything it's supposed to know is already programmed in its genetic code. It knows how to swim, orient itself, and hunt. For the young damselfish, finding shelter is crucial. This sea sponge is the perfect island, at least for now. The young green turtles are extracted from their sand cradle. Not even 1 in 1,000 will reach adulthood. But, whatever the omens, the call of the wild is too strong, and they'll all have to face life in the deepest of waters. Other nurseries are spread out in the ocean, and under its ghostly appearance, the willowy is a wreck of choice. She was put back afloat by dedicated seamen after her first sinking, but she was meant to lie at the bottom of the sea, and a storm quickly sent her back to her guardians. By now, her structure has become an incredible, colorful garden. Food is aplenty, and hiding places are many. The perfect grounds to start swimming. The young damselfish carry out very intricate choreographies to keep an eye on their piece of the wreck. The crew spots them quickly with their yellow outfit, which will disappear when they reach adulthood. They feed on small invertebrates and tiny algae, and they cultivate and maintain. These young fish have no fear and fight any intruder daring to cross the boundaries of their territories, whatever their size. The blue chromies and masked gobies chose to face the currents and catch prey within their reach. Why bother cultivating one's food or picking it when the currents are favorable? The windlass, used to pull up the anchor in the past, has been converted into a cleaning station. The fish right before the crew's eyes is known as a curong, and it just got rid of the parasite on its scales. The cleaner is this small blue and yellow fish known as a young Spanish hogfish. This exchange of services allows it to eat with little effort, and the curong gets to be freed from the intruders attached to its skin. We look at the inside of the wreck, which gives us the opportunity to discover a few inhabitants hidden in the darkness. These gray angelfish constitute a loyal couple that will last several years. Other divers might even come across their offspring one day, youngsters who, in turn, will play a role in the future of their species and the reef. A parrotfish gets agitated on the deck and attracts the crew's attention. How do you get rid of a remora that's a bit too clingy without hands? Finally, This opportunist seems to choose one of the crew. When talking about the evolution of the species, the crew did not expect one quite like this. They slowly go back up to allow their bodies to recover from the pressure fluctuations. They must wait another few minutes before getting back to the surface. They enjoy this aurora borealis and reach the last of their safety spots. Finally, they can talk again and share their latest encounters with emotion. This crew brings back some images from this hour in immersion, and once dried up, they take the time to discover them. This moment allows them to relive the dive, identify the fish they saw, and try to understand their behavior. They then realize that they missed some events, but even more are invisible to the naked eye. While the team continues wondering if the fish is the one of the right size, a multitude of crustacean newborns, coral, and fish are freed around the willow-eye. Limited in their movements, they are quickly snatched to join the plankton and start their life as the current decide. They might be taken to outer sea, to a reef, or even a new wreck. It is now the Kanaga's turn to get to the sea. The scenery passes on the other side of the surface, and everyone seems to be pursuing their own destiny. While unchanging their shell, the crew dares to modify the course of their own destiny. But throughout this trip, while they've sailed from one shipwreck to another, they observe more similarities between the wrecks than differences. They are on an epic journey, which eventually goes beyond their armor. An adventure shared with billions of living beings around a huge blue shell. The C-46 looks like a mirage in the middle of a sea of sand, but life is around in this oasis as if it's always been there. Vestige of an ephemeral tragedy, these remains, abandoned in the ocean, have become a refuge for several animal species. The fantasy of the nature's forgiveness, a resilience, and a cohabitation between humans and nature. Species take ownership of this feat to make it their image. Protected from the currents, visitors come to go in this carcass. Nature is a play, which has been ongoing for almost 4 billion years. It involves the history of living, a fragile balance between cohabitation, war, love, learning, and fate. This story will continue until corrosion has completed its work, and the wreck is erased by winds and currents. The Kanaga willingly plays this role of a short-lived island. Her inhabitants choose to settle there for a few years, a few days, or just long enough to rest their wings. In the end, all inhabitants, whether on land or in the sea, will do once again what species have done for billions of years. Venture off in the hope of finding a new shell.